the recording. Today's lecture is the next installment in the chapter 2 on culture as it's studied and understood by sociologists. And I want to try to give you an indication of, or I want to show you how to rely on your own pre-existing understandings, plural, of, in this case, the concept of culture, the reality of culture. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I think will allow at least most of you to recognize from your own already developing sense of the world that you live in, some of the ways that sociologists, some of the phenomena that sociologists who are interested in culture have looked at in order to try to understand how the reality of culture in our lives can become the object of sociological analysis, and how analyzing that reality can fit into how we can improve that reality. So I want to do two things. I want to demonstrate to you some of the ways in which culture is a real thing. And maybe some of the ways in which there's resistance to the claim that culture is a real thing. What are some of the ways that people can be skeptical about the reality of culture? Is culture real? Okay, so I will repeat the question, and then I will. Is culture real? So how do you know? Let's say I didn't. Let's say I disagreed with you, and I invited the class to decide who's right. You, whoever, I think it was Tisha and JT who said yes, culture is real. Right. So to claim that it is learned, let me just get it right, learned and shared behavior doesn't really get us all the way to what it is I'm trying to get you to think about for a second. Which part of that is real? What is real? For example, what would be real about shared behavior? Well, let's see if my examples provide any help. Let me, how am I gonna, no, okay, so I'm on the wrong, just a second here. Share application. So does anyone know who Judy Payette is? Who's Judy Payette? Nope. Payette is the last name. Julie Payette. Yeah. Yes, exactly. GG. So JT, help us out. Maybe not everyone know that. There we go. That's the key part. She's the uh, former governor general. And why is she the former governor general? Well, let's go to my the slide that I wanted, or the uh, so can you see on the screen the website for the National Post? Okay, great. So I didn't check the date of this, whenever it was. This would have been a recent one. Let me just go back and double check. So 3 days ago. Uh, so Julie Payette, who was the governor general, uh, was resigned from that position. And the reason, and so why did she resign? What does this headline tell you, and how, what is this about? There we go. Perfect. So here's an example of a way that the reality of culture uh, operates in our society. So Julie Payette was the governor general. Uh, it's kind of a big thing, I guess. It depends on how you see it, but it's a big enough thing anyway that it was a headline story in the news for a while. And she was the boss, and she had, the way bosses often do, a lot of power. And she was put in that place by an order in council of the prime minister. She was she was forced to step down. She actually, it's a little bit trickier than that. She stepped down. She resigned her position. And the context of that resignation is a report that was prepared by some independent contractor, some consulting company, interviewed a number of employees and former employees in order to evaluate whether or not allegations that had been made against her and her second in charge, I forget the person's name, but it was alleged, and this report confirmed to a great degree that the allegations were warranted, that she had created a toxic workplace culture. And as a result of that, the government basically forced her to step down. So this is an example of what people mean when they say that culture is a real thing. And one measure of the reality of it is that a boss was forced to step down. Someone with a lot of power, someone who, and evidence of her power is that she was able to get away with this abusive and terrible behavior that in many, many other contexts would not be tolerated. And so, in spite of her relative power advantage in that workplace, ultimately, her responsibility for creating this workplace culture resulted in her being forced out of a job, seemingly at least against her will. And so that's one of the ways in which we have available to us, we as non-sociologists, simply we as readers of the National Post, we as members of society, when we read a story like this and we see that Rideau Hall, there was a toxic workplace culture in Rideau Hall, that's one of the ways that we use and we understand the term to designate a reality. Now I'm going to switch over to my slides and pick up the next example. Wait a minute. So I have a quote here from a book called Employment and Labor Law Toolbox, what Ontario employers need to know. And this is what how the quote reads. In addition to education and experience, a vital consideration is how the job applicant would fit within the company culture. The success of your company depends on a clear understanding by all employees of and a commitment to the values, work ethic, and standards of performance set by management. So what does this sentence say? It's providing a definition of culture, at least in the context of employment and labor law. From the perspective of an employer who's trying to understand what the law allows them to do and forbids them to do, the legal framework within which the employment relation operates, company culture is a real thing. And they go on, the next sentence after this reads, to support the claim that that's a real consideration for an employer, the sentence goes on to say, in a recent decision of the Superior Court of Justice, evidence of a corporate culture committed to honesty, trustworthiness, and mutual respect, as well as training of the company employees in the company's vision, defeated a claim of wrongful dismissal brought by an employee who had removed company product of small value without paying for it. So the context, I went and looked at an article about the decision. I didn't read the decision itself, but an employee of a grocery store was fired for stealing some yogurt and some cream cheese. He stole, or she, I forget, 5 items that had small value. So the point was, so what would be the point here? What do you think is going on in this decision and in this sentence? And then we'll pull the camera back a little bit to try to see how that might relate to what it is I'm talking about. That is culture and the notion that culture is real. Why would it matter that the product has small value? So the employee stole, let's say for the sake of argument, $20 worth of food from the grocery store. Actually, it turns out, according to the article I read about this, that was what the employee claimed. But so what's the suit? What is the why? So the Superior Court of Justice heard this claim. So the company fired the employee, and then the employee filed a suit against the company for wrongful dismissal. And the judge in this case said, no, that wasn't wrongful dismissal. The employer was within their rights to fire that employee, even though the only thing the employee did was to steal $20 worth of stuff from the grocery store. What does that have to do? So what I'm trying to talk about here, what I'm trying to get you to think about is, what is culture? What are some of the ways that the notion of culture operates, and what is the reality of the way that notion operates? And I'm talking now in particular about the way we think of what happens in a workplace as being described as workplace culture. In the case of the Governor General's office, she was in charge, and the allegation is that as the person in charge, she was responsible for maintaining a certain kind of culture. And the culture she created, her responsibility, was her fault that she created the wrong kind of culture. And as a result, she got booted out of this job. If she didn't like the job, she could have just quit on her own. And it seems right. So JT got most of that. What the claim here is in the book, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But so the way the book describes this is the decision of the Superior Court of Justice was that a certain corporate culture existed such that the employer was entitled to dismiss the employee for stealing. Now, if you don't know anything about Canadian employment law, you might think, and in some there are places in the world where they don't work like this. So employment law absolutely varies from place to place. But in Ontario, an employer, you might think that if you stole 1 penny, that would be a good enough reason for your employer to be able to fire you. But that's not the case in Ontario. In Ontario, you can't just fire someone because you feel like it. You can't fire someone because you don't like them. You can't fire someone because they stole $20 worth of stuff from you or from your company. You need more than that. And the argument here is that what you need is the Superior Court of Justice acknowledged as a legitimate reason to fire someone for an offense that otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to fire them for. And that is that if they allowed this employee to get away with stealing even something that is in the big picture not a lot of money, that it would undermine the corporate culture, the workplace culture, and that society has a stake in a company's, an organization's ability to sustain a specific culture in that workplace. So workplace culture is a real enough thing that it can give the employer the right that it otherwise wouldn't have to terminate an employee's position. So what I want to call to your attention here, among other things, what I want to call to your attention here is that in Ontario and in Canada and in lots of other jurisdictions, but I know very little about these other jurisdictions, so I'm just going to focus here on this specific example. The legal system in Canada recognizes that corporate culture is a real thing. It's something that the employer can create, that the employer is responsible to maintain, and that employees are responsible to maintain. So in one case, it was a boss who was gotten rid of because of failures to create and sustain a culture that is compatible with the goals of the organization. And here, an employee was terminated because of their failure to meet the requirements of that corporate culture. Does any of that make sense? Culture is a real thing, is what I'm trying to say. But the reality of that culture isn't quite so simple to demonstrate. And the idea of a corporate culture entering into a court's decision, the idea that there's a corporate culture could generate legally enforceable responsibilities on the part of the employer and on the part of the employee is a relatively speaking new development in Ontario and in the world. That used to not be understood to be the kind of consideration that an employer had a responsibility to foster, that an employee had a right to expect. So in the case of Julie Payette, the flip side is that the employees who worked in the Governor General's office and the Governor General's mansion were entitled to working in a workplace culture that protected their interests, that it wasn't enough that she was the boss and therefore she could get away with whatever she wanted. Culture is an intervening variable that mediates the employer-employee relationship. Another angle on this is our relationship, the relationship that exists between your professor and you as the students, and you towards each other as classmates, and you as students to me as a professor. That culture is moderated through the rules of Seneca College. There's a student code of conduct that's binding on students. There is my employment contract negotiated. There's a collective agreement that constrains how it is that I can go about doing my job. There's human rights legislation in vigor in Ontario that determines some of the things that I'm not allowed to do in the pursuit of my job. And likewise, so that our interactions in the context online and in a classroom are not solely constrained by the requirements of the educational pursuit. They're also constrained by other sorts of considerations. And that's one way that sociologists understand the notion of culture from the sociology side. But from our own side, from our own lived experience, we can recognize the way that is a real thing. Unfortunately, the chances are that some of the people in the class, some of the people listening, have worked in an environment where the employment culture was terrible, where your boss was systematically a jerk. Now, typically, when a workplace culture begins to deteriorate or is bad, it's bad in specific ways. And so workplace culture can be toxic when the boss is a sexist pig, or when the boss is violent, or there's a number of different, or employees. I mean, it's the toxicity can come from different places. But a key feature here that I'm going to use to develop the notion a little bit further is that in terms of a workplace, there's an existing power dynamic in terms of a workplace. How does that work? What is the, how do you think, what do you think I'm talking about when I talk about a power dynamic that structures the workplace? Right. So that, thank you, JT. Uh, that describes the main division in the power dynamic of a workplace. There's the people in charge, and so there's management and there's workers, more or less. That's the one way of understanding the fundamental structure of the power dynamic in most workplaces. There's management and there's workers. Managements make the rules, and workers implement those rules and do the work. In practice, that relationship is dynamic, and but that's the main thing. And in Ontario, anyway, and arguably, at least around the world, everywhere, by definition, management has more power over the establishment and the maintenance of the workplace reality, the workplace environment. And over the last 50 years or so, human resources practice, human resources education, the way in business schools, managers are trained and managers are taught that in addition to, let me start back a step. For the most part, why do people go to work? And what's the main, what do you think the main reason is that people go to work? Right, but narrow it down a little bit. How does going to work allow you? Yes, to make money, right? So it's the money. You go to work to get paid. And for a long time, economists argued as though that was the only thing and nothing else made sense, that the only way to understand what was going on in the workplace was to take a look at the money. But it turns out that that's not quite enough. And among other things, it turns out that in addition to the amount of money that they make, employees care about the conditions under which they work. And it turns out that employers care about why do some employers care about what their employees care about? What's in it from the not employers necessarily as individuals, employers considered more in a sort of corporate way. So you show up to your job to get money. Why does the company you work for hire you? Or hire anybody, not just you? They need labor. The labor is going to do some work. What do they get? What do they do with the work that's produced by their labor? So imagine a scenario where I own a table making company and you're all my employees. And we've been in business for, say, 10 years. Some of you have been with us for 10 years. Some of you have only been with us for a few less years. I pay you all, because I'm a super nice guy, I pay you all $50 an hour to build tables. You show up to work to make $50 an hour. What's in it for me? Right, I sell tables. So I buy wood, I own a shop, I pay the electricity bills, and I buy the tools and so on. And you show up to work and you build tables. And then at the end of the day or the week or the month, we have a bunch of tables, and I sell those tables. And if I'm doing it properly, I get more money back from selling my tables than I have to pay out in rent and electricity and wages. Now, how do I go about deciding that I'm going to pay you $50 an hour, right? In real life, I don't think that people get paid $50 an hour to build tables in a workshop. How do I go about deciding the wage? Right, explain that, Rebecca. So how do you understand margins? That's exactly right, but that might not explain anything to people who don't know what a margin is in this context. Basically, I need some information first. I need to know how much are the tables that I'm selling, the out there, people are buying tables. The reason I built a workshop, the reason I have a workshop, the reason I'm paying you and I'm buying wood and all that is because I believe that there are people who are willing to buy tables, and I'm making the tables in order to sell them. But when I set the price, if I set the price at $4 million a table, and they're just wooden tables that serve as, say, study tables for students, how many tables am I likely to sell at $4 million a table? Zero. What I've got to find out is what are comparable tables selling for in the marketplace. And then I've got to work backwards from that and figure out, well, can I build a table at that price or maybe a penny lower than that price, because everything else remaining the same, the people who are buying the tables, they don't care if they're buying it from me or from someone else. If they can buy that table for a penny less, that's what margin means. If there's a marginal advantage to the buyer, they'll go where that marginal advantage exists. So if I can make a table that's, say, $10 less than the exact same table from a buying point of view, then I'll be able to sell my tables. Everybody pays the same for electricity, more or less. Everybody pays the same for wood, more or less, and for the tools, more or less. And also, everybody pays the same, more or less, for their employees' wages. So if all the other table makers are paying their employees $50, then I'm going to have to pay $50 to get if I can find employees at less than $50, then I can sell my tables for less than my competitors, and I can make a go of this. It turns out, though, that so wages are stratified, and that stratification of wages is largely, not exclusively by any means, but largely determined by what it is that the employees are producing. So there's not that much movement in wages when you compare different services and industries and so on. When employees are interviewed, it turns out that when they're less happy, they're not as productive. So what's in it from an employer's point of view is that unhappy employees are less productive employees. One way to make the employees happy is to increase their wages, but that's expensive. Another way to increase employees' happiness is to improve the culture. And so culture entered into employer-employee relationships as an independent variable that is partly under the control of employers as a way of improving their worker productivity, which produces increased profits for the organization or increased results for the organization. This kind of approach to culture isn't exclusive to for-profit corporate organizations, it's also true in all kinds of other contexts. The culture within which, the culture that describes the relationship among people who are working together for whatever reason, has an impact on the people involved in that cooperation. It has an impact on their ability to achieve the goals for which they're cooperating. And so culture is really the name of the results of the ongoing reality of the conditions that allow for that cooperation. If we go back a slide, 2 slides, I guess I left the blank one in there. In this employment and labor law toolbox written for employers, what they say is that the success of your company depends on a clear understanding by all employees of and a commitment to the values, work ethic, and standards of performance set by management. So that's what culture amounts to from the point of view of an employment lawyer giving advice to employers. So the value to the employer of understanding what the culture is that the success of their company depends in part on the creation of that kind of culture. So now let me just move forward. So when we take a look at, so in the textbook, culture at its broadest is described by the author, by Bob Brim, as social problem solving that's transmitted from one generation to the next. So it's important to understand that by and large, sociologists are trying to understand reality as it exists over time rather than just a snapshot. By and large, sociologists are interested in processes as they exist in time rather than as they're frozen. Now, in a certain way, you need to understand each moment as it accumulates, but really it's not cultural until it exists over time. So, for example, if Julie Payette had shown up at work just one day and had lost her temper, nobody would consider that to be creating a toxic workplace. Everyone knows that people have a bad day. It's still irresponsible. It's still being a bad boss. It's not the employee's problem if the boss is having a bad day. And most grown-ups understand that we have a responsibility to keep our own problems and to solve our own problems and not dump them on other people. But having one bad day at work doesn't mean, that's not what people mean when they talk about the culture at work. What they mean is on a day to day to day basis over time as the workplace takes on its own kind of thing. I imagine that those of you who've had a number of jobs will have noticed that in some of those jobs, it's fun to go to work, and in some of those jobs, it's not fun to go to work. And that sometimes has to do with the work that's being done. And so if you, you know, has anyone been to, does anyone know what I'm talking about? Has anyone been worked in a place where the culture was toxic? Well, of course, I'm glad if you haven't. But has anyone worked? What has anyone worked where the culture was amazing? I'll try a different tack. The other angle that I was hoping to develop, but I didn't really find the resources in time, is the classroom culture. And so one of the challenges that my colleagues and I are facing when we're addressing the transition that we're currently implementing between in class and online, especially for older teachers like me, I'm used to teaching in class, and I'm used to the kind of classroom culture that I came to be used to as a student. And I've tried over my career to reproduce the elements that I thought were productive in a classroom setting. But doing this online compared to doing it in class is very different. An online culture, to the degree that that makes sense, is different from an online classroom. So what I'm asking you now to think about is, think back to your high school years and how one year you might have had a good English class, and the next year you might have had a lousy English class or math or gym or whatever. Some classes you enjoyed going to, and some classes you didn't enjoy going to. Now, some of that is going to be about you liking math or not liking math. But sometimes what happens is that even so, I for sure, some of you will have had a math class that surprised you because, oh wow, it turns out I can enjoy some aspects of math. Any of this ringing a bell? Does any of this correspond to your experiences as students? So Tisha, maybe you can help me out a bit. Can you explain a little bit the differences that you've understood me to be trying to talk about? Be awesome if you turned your microphone on. That would help our culture here, but you don't have to. In a certain way, I'm sure that you all know almost exactly what it is I'm talking about. Uh, how many people here think, how many people who are listening think that not everyone else understands the difference I'm talking about between a fun class and a not fun class? I'm going to have to learn how to do the survey thing, but I don't know how to do that yet. Okay, Douglas, thank you. Right. Now here, now that I'm not quite so sure about. So let me just get back to that last comment. How am I going to find that? All classes are fun, just depends on you. Um, does anybody disagree with that? Here's where I'm. No fun class in my country. Well, that's an excellent point. Um, Part of what I want to do with the notion of culture, uh, part of the, I want to demonstrate that culture works in a couple of different ways that are all real, each in their own different ways. And so there's workplace culture and there's classroom culture, but there's also a national culture. And the idea of the classroom being fun, it doesn't even make sense in certain countries, in certain national cultures, in certain time periods. When I was your age, students spoke about, for sure, we compared what one class would be like, and definitely from the student point of view, it seems like that it's almost all up to the professor or the teacher. It turns out to be a little bit more complicated than that. But we did compare that. But the professors themselves, when I became eventually a professor, I read a little bit about this. The idea that a professor had a responsibility to the students to make the subject matter fun, to make the classroom experience fun, didn't exist. It was up to the students to either like it or not like it. Not my problem. I'm going to teach sociology, and if you like it or you don't like it, has nothing to do with my job. That was the attitude when I started, say in 1980. Roughly speaking, that was the attitude. Now, some professors, for whatever reason, they enjoyed it more when it was fun for everybody, this kind of thing. But it had nothing to do really with the way management organized the delivery of post-secondary education. But as it turns out, not surprisingly, when you think about it, students learn better when there's a good classroom culture. The tricky part is deciding what's going to count as a good classroom culture. And it's not enough that the students are having fun in their class for it to be a good classroom culture. If you had to go about deciding from a policy point of view, not from a student point of view, but from a, say, Ontario-wide point of view. If you were the Ontario Minister of Higher Education and you wanted to set up some way of measuring whether or not the classrooms were being run properly, what is it you'd want to know about what's going on as a result of the students having been involved in the class? What do you think the province of Ontario gets out of students going to post-secondary education? This class, even. Okay, right. So the next generation entering the workforce. So what does classroom culture have to do with the next generation entering the workforce? Right. So, but I'm asking you to try to think down to what's happening right this second. How, in terms of culture, there we go, Min. Thank you. That's excellent. So, a good classroom will be a classroom where students get through their program and then enter into the workforce. What does culture have to do with having this be a good classroom? We don't know. So I'm not saying there's an answer to this. Culture is the name of the problem, the name of the question that we have. To describe what is the atmosphere, or what is the ecology, what is the medium through which what I'm trying to do and what you are trying to do is occurring. Well, now that's a little, I think you're right there, and that the culture you learn here is the culture you will bring with you to the workplace. And then as you get used to whatever workplace you're in, you'll adapt, or or you'll get fired, or you'll find a different job or whatever, but you'll adapt. Now, there's a classroom specific culture, and then there's a workplace specific culture, and those are not identical. Or at least this is how sociologists overwhelmingly, I think unanimously, but at least overwhelmingly use the term culture. That culture has a specificity as an organizational specificity. Another example would be sports. I don't know if any of you have played team sports, but growing up, and into my young adult life, I played team sports. And there's a kind of culture that exists in sports that's different from the culture that existed in school and different from the culture that existed in the workplace. And there's also a national level culture, as Shi Chen mentioned, with a smiley, but I think that there was some attempt at making a true claim. I wonder if you would be prepared to confirm that. I don't know how to get back to this. I've lost this. No, I can't find it anymore. It's kind of irritating. Where is it? There we go. So maybe I can do it this way. I'm pretty sure that you will be able to remember teachers in high school that you liked who were super friendly, but also having teachers who weren't super friendly, but who managed in a different way to create a productive learning environment. Am I right about that? That was my experience. And it seems to me that just that there are a number of different ways and a number of different kinds of productive cultures. Does that correspond to your experience? Some of you at least? Well, the clock's ticking, so I'm going to have to move on. I want to get to so now we saw in the definition of in that quote I took from the law book on employment law from the point of view of the employer, and the detail of it was, let me just quickly look at it. So the way that the employer, the labor lawyer described workplace culture had to do with the performance standards and the rules and the values that were going to be set by the employer for the employees in their performance of their work. And that's described in that context as a strategy, the implementation of a strategy by the employer to solve what problem? What is the problem being solved by workplace culture? What does an employer need you to do in general? What's the most general description of what it is you think your bosses are expecting you to do when you clock in to your job? But be a little bit more specific, not just work. not just any old work. They don't want you to just come in and do push-ups unless you have some push-up job, I guess. But they want you to come in and let's use my made up example of me running a table factory. If you work in the paint shop at the table factory, when you show up to work at 9 o'clock, you go into the paint shop and you start painting table legs. How is that contributing? What problem is it that your work is solving for me as the person who is running the table factory? Okay, let's try it this way. Imagine these two following scenarios. You and I are friends, and I know that you are a good carpenter, and I ask you as a favor to build me a table. That's one scenario. In the other scenario, I own this table factory, you're a carpenter, I'm paying you, and you've been hired and you've agreed to work for me. You've agreed to work for me at the wage that we came to our agreement on. And you're going to show up and you're going to build that table. What's the difference between those two scenarios in terms of what it is that I want and what it is that I expect out of my relationship to you? On the one hand, when you're doing me a favor, and on the other hand, when I'm paying you. So let's say we're friends, and I know that you're a skilled carpenter, and I tell you, look, it's my son's birthday, and I'd like to do something really special for him. I went out and I bought some wood, and et cetera, et cetera. And would you do me a favor? This is important to me. We're friends, and I would be really grateful if you would build a really nice desk for my son. He's, he's going to high school now, and et cetera, et cetera. So you say, sure, we're friends. I promise I will build you that table. That's one scenario. Then there's another scenario. I'm your boss. We're not friends. I pay you $32 an hour. You've been working for me for 12 years. Everything's going fine. And we have a new order in, and the table is going to get built. What's the difference between those two scenarios? Right. So Fatima has identified the names, how to describe those two things. But if when I'm your boss, I have a different, when I'm your boss and you're my employee, we set the way the norms, values, the nature of that cooperation exists differently than if we're friends. Both of those, friendship is also, from a sociological point of view, is also an institution. And norms and values, and in a way, mores and taboos um, mediate that relationship. If we're friends and you give me your word and you don't live up to your word, that puts pressure on our friendship. But it's not automatically going to be the end of the road. In a human society, we organize our relationships in Ontario. I'm sure this is true in all societies, but I don't know that. In Ontario, uh, friendship is broadly construed to be a very important kind of relationship that's different from there are people who are your friends and there are people who you have contact with who aren't your friends. So another way of trying to get to where I'm trying to go is there a difference between, so There are people who are your friends, correct? And there are people you know who are not your friends. Is that true? Now, it's probably also true that there are some people right now that eventually will become your friends. If you've just started work somewhere, you don't yet know this, but in 2 years from now, someone you started work with this week will end up being your best friend for the rest of your life, and you don't know it yet. When you work, and in 40 years from now, when you're both multimillionaires and celebrating your retirement, your grandchildren will ask you, well, when did you two become friends? And you probably won't have exactly the same story or exactly the same time frame for when it happened. So friendship doesn't have absolutely uh, exhaustive boundaries. But there's a difference. There's a difference between the people you are casually connected to and the people with whom you have a different kind of relationship. Friendship, in that way, generates its own culture. But also, in different cultures, friendships are moderated in different ways. If you're my friend and if I'm your friend compared to if you're my boss. So, among other things, you can be friends with your boss. That can happen. It turns out one of my former bosses, we didn't know this when we both started working together. Actually, when we started working together, he wasn't even my boss yet, but he eventually became my boss. And it turns out that his mom and my mom went to nursing school together, and his mom and my mom knew each other from when they were young, and my mom worked with his dad, and like it was a funny kind of coincidence, and so we became friends. He was my boss, and he was my is my friend. But by and large, those are different relationships. They can overlap and they can even conflict with each other. And it's the same with cultures. Cultures exist, but they're mediated by difficult to understand, difficult to clearly delimit. Legal relationships are much easier to delimit, and sometimes some of the aspects of culture are over time um, institutionalized to include and to spell out in a more and more clear cut and institutionalized way the terms, the norms, and the values that dictate the nature of that cooperation. And so the sociological interpretation of culture, the way the reality of culture is studied by sociologists, is to try to, one of the ways anyway, is to try to understand it in that continuum from informal relationships all the way to the very regularized and specified terms of employment. Friendship is a cultural institution. Work is a cultural institution. Both of those involve cooperation. Both of those involve norms and values and mores and taboos. And in both instances, society depends on, in a variety of ways, the continued existence of society it depends on those institutions operating in a certain kind of way. What would happen to our society if the workplace stopped operating the way it does? Let me be less general. What are the consequences of a toxic workplace? Why should the rest of us care about Julie Payette being a terrible boss? Okay, here, let me go back to my earlier slide. In order for this to happen, in order for the province of Ontario maintains a superior court. It's very expensive. And the company has employees and it's expensive. And the employee who got fired had to go to court to try to keep his or her job, and it didn't work out. Why? How does Ontario society benefit from having this mechanism in place? Right? If we're just worried about her salary, we'll just get rid of her, right? Presumably, she's performing a function that is a benefit to our society. And as a result of the culture that's been created, she's better able, the organization of which she is the head, that she's in charge of, is in a better position compared to all the other ways that we understand so far of organizing that, is in a better position to do what it's there to do. It increases the efficiency of the institution and the organization and the practice that's governed by and that's realized through that culture. The reason the college cares about the employee employer culture is because the college believes, and there's enormous evidence to suggest that they're right to believe this, that creating a positive culture for the employees isn't just a benefit, subjective benefit for the employees. It allows the institution to perform more effectively. Classroom culture is important, not just because it makes it more fun for the students or more fun for the teacher. Classroom culture is important to the degree that it produces better outcomes for the students, and also therefore and through producing better outcomes for the students, it produces better outcomes for the society that set up the learning institution in the first place. And so when we get to this slide here, the payoff is in the production point of it. Culture is a mechanism through which cooperation allows for production. And human life is impossible without production. Why is that? In what sense is that true, is really what I mean. In a very practical way, that grocery store, this is where we get food in Ontario, and for the most part, in many, many places, the large bulk of the human population in 2021 gets its food through grocery stores. Grocery stores stay open because they're businesses, because they're able to make enough money for it to be worth the while of the people who own those businesses. Those businesses can make money only when the employees don't steal all of the profits. Creating the right kind of culture means that we can eat. If we don't have the right kind of culture, we're not going to be able to eat. That's the basic construction of culture as it's understood by sociologists. Now, I have a problem with the nature of this diagram. I think the diagram, the arrows in the diagram are too simplistic, and I'm going to try to, I'm not very good with graphics, but I'm going to try to fix that. I'm going to try to add onto that backwards arrows to describe what I think is a more complete picture of the origin and components of culture. And next week, hopefully I will have that slide done, and we'll wrap up chapter 2 next week. Okay, I appreciate your patience staying with me a little longer than the hour that was allotted to me. And so that's the end of the lecture today. I will turn off the recording now.